How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another book review that we're going to do. Today, as you've seen by the thumbnail, we're going to review Atlas of the Heart by Brené Brown. I first encountered this material through a TV special. I believe it was originally hosted by HBO, I think, but I watched it on Apple Plus or HBO. I can't. It was either Max or it was Apple Plus, but I watched Brené Brown's TV special. I believe it's 5 episodes that you can watch on Atlas of the Heart. And I was impressed. I was impressed with what I saw. I thought it was eye-opening. I had a few notes. I had a few negative takeaways here or there, but I've got some things to say about that. But after watching the TV spot, I thought, well, let me go read the book because I'll get more information. And I thought something really interesting after reading the book was that you actually get more information from the TV show than you do from reading her book, which is not common. It's not typical. But when you understand really what her book does, maybe it makes a little bit more sense. So let's dive into this interesting conversation on Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart and mix in a little bit of what I think is an interesting conversation of churches and clergy versus therapists and counselors. I think there's an interesting world that I've been tapping into, and I want to get into that. So, firstly, what is this book? This book is a dictionary. It's a list of dictionary definitions. Now, she writes it in kind of story form. It's pretty narrative, but ultimately, this book is broken down into definitions on emotions. Brené has this interesting theory that I thought it's a philosophy, really, and it plays out pretty well. She says that language is a portal, and a portal takes you to places you could not otherwise go. So she basically, we need the right language to access the right emotion and meaning in our lives. And so she's going to teach us how to communicate better our emotions, some emotional language that we're lacking. Brené Brown's background, she is a researcher, and she likes to call herself a shame expert. And now I've also watched her TED Talk. I've watched her on podcasts and other interviews with her. I think she's a fantastic communicator, and I think the work she does is really good, and I think she's very talented. So I want to say some positive things before I get into what were, I think, just any negative takeaways I have are more indicative of the culture that we find ourselves in and the culture war that's being waged. I think she is a soldier in that culture war, whether she would like to be or not. And I feel like she's gotten caught up a little bit in that. And I think I have too. And I want to talk about that. First, let me talk about this book and the TV spot. And I want to say, if you want to engage with this material, buying her book is really not necessary. I highly recommend you subscribe for anywhere from $10 to $15 to $7. I don't know what it is. To whoever her TV special is. It's either on Max or it's on Apple Plus. I cannot remember. I think it's Apple Plus. I think I watched it on Apple Plus. But either way, that's the better way to engage with this. And then if you want just a little bit more information with a much higher price tag, you can buy the book. But in her book, she goes through these various emotions and gives us definitions on them. In her TV spot, she had a room filled with people. She kind of teaches and explains and goes with a Q&A style with the around, the around the room to people who have questions. She had picked out certain specialists and people that she'd known to be in the audience. It's far more engaging, entertaining, and informative than her book. But that being said, I did enjoy her book. I think I read the whole thing in about 4 hours. So maybe less, maybe 2 hours. It's an easy read. It looks impressive, but it's very artistic for a book. I like the gold filigree on the front. I'm always a big fan of that. But yeah, so she's grouped emotions into, I think, very cool narrative style. So places we go when things are uncertain or too much. Places we go when things are uncertain or too much. And here she explains stress, overwhelm, anxiety, worry, avoidance, excitement, dread, fear, vulnerability, right? Then she goes, places we go when we compare, and she's got more. And so Brené does a good job of empowering us with language and clarifying our language. I think the most eye-opening one was the difference between jealousy and envy and how people always get that wrong. So you'll see someone go on an awesome vacation and go, oh, I'm so jealous. and you're really not jealous. Jealousy is involved with relationships and people. It doesn't have to be romantic. A child can be jealous over the attention a mother gives a sibling. But envy is more materialistic or experience driven. So you can be envious of someone's status. You can be envious of someone's vacation. You can be envious of someone's car. And so ultimately, it's funny. There's this old Bill Clinton quote, which is, "It depends on what your definition of is." And I'm far too young to have heard Bill Clinton say that, but that stuck in my brain as a kid. When I got into college and I started having religious debates with friends who were also religious, I had this friend who we bickered, we bickered for probably 3 hours. And ultimately, at the end of it, I realized, he wouldn't admit it, but I realized that we agreed. And what we were really debating over was a clarification of terms. And if we both had the same dictionary, then we could have gotten past that 3-hour debate and gone on to more productive conversation. And that's what I think is interesting about Brené Brown, is if someone is familiar with her work, if someone has read her book, if someone has been educated by her or influenced by her materials, then you can have a really productive conversation. But if you have her dictionary of terms and what they mean, and the person you're conversing with doesn't, it's not necessarily going to be productive to use her definition if they have it wrong. So if someone says, "Oh, you went on vacation, I'm so jealous," and Brené Brown clarified that, well, the real word you should use there is envious, and the other person doesn't know that, do you teach them? It's so weird. So there's a limit on how helpful this can be. Brené Brown also has an interesting philosophy, and I think that's what's interesting about all of these books on my shelf, is when you get into, I thought when I got into neuroscience and psychology, I thought when I started studying these things, it would just be hard, clear facts. Really, it is just a series of philosophies. So we last talked about internal family systems. That's a philosophy. We're going to talk in the future about cognitive behavioral therapy. That's a philosophy. So this is another philosophy of care. But she talks about near enemies. And I think what's interesting from the idea of near enemies is I believe she's pulling on like some Buddhist teaching and some psychological frameworks when she gets into this, but it's the idea of negative emotions. So she talks about compassion versus pity, which I thought was very helpful. So it's important that for me, when I'm doing work with people, whether it's as a pastor or a mentor or a coach, whatever, that I'm not pitying them. And that's something that I talked with a client recently when they were like, how do you relate to people and know so much? And I was just saying, well, I don't see myself as higher than anyone. That would be pity. Oh, you pitiful little thing. Let me come from my stoop on high and help you. Compassion puts yourself in the shoes with the person and say, hey, we're all learning, right? That's why I love my focus on ministry is I'm not a teacher who's going to tell you all wisdom. I am someone who's going to point you to Jesus or point you to scripture or point you to higher learning, where I'm going to say, I don't have all the answers, but I know someone who does. His name is Jesus, right? It's the Bible. Or I'm not an expert in psychology, but let me point you towards psychology and shade it a little bit and encourage you to go learn and dabble in these things. So compassion puts yourself on an even playing field. And I think that's where, like, for example, Moses says to God, what are we going to do with these people when he's frustrated with the Israelites? And in doing that, Moses counted himself maybe even equal with God or definitely above all the people, kind of in his own sphere with God. And it's right after that Moses is told he's not going to enter the promised land. So I think even biblically, there would be a good support for this near enemy, right? We have empathy versus sympathy. We have connection versus control, courage versus recklessness. And so I think that when you look at internal family systems, where Richard Schwartz was saying, well, there's no bad parts, there's no bad emotions, Brené Brown takes a different approach to that, saying, no, there are some bad emotions. There are some negative things. And I think you can rectify that. I think you can play in internal family systems and you can play with Brené Brown and you can you can identify that, well, maybe pity needs to be redeemed, right? So there's some work there to combine these teachings. But I think that Brené is closer to my take on emotions than maybe Richard Schwartz was. Richard Schwartz was like, there's no bad emotions, there's nothing negative. Brené Brown's okay with being like, pity's toxic, this is toxic. And I do think, though, that, and let's get into a deeper conversation. So I want to wrap up this section by saying this is an interesting dictionary of terms and emotions, and is useful if you have the extra money. How much was this? I don't know how much I paid for this, but it's quite the beautiful book. It's good to put on a coffee table. It's definitely a centerpiece. It's very artistic, as you can see from the design of the book. But it's more of a conversational piece than it is, I would say, deep literature. Definitely icebreaker, thought-provoking, useful mind setting. Hey, make sure you're communicating your emotions. I don't think it's any replacement for like an emotions wheel. So I love emotions wheels. I have an app on my phone called the Wheel of Feels. And the Wheel of Feels, it's something where you can start with some basic emotions where it's like, I'll give you guys an example of what's on my phone. So you can go, oh, I'm feeling sad. Well, sad's not specific enough. So underneath sad, we have hurt, depressed, guilty, despair, vulnerable, lonely. And so I would go, okay, if I'm having a down day, I'm like, I'm feeling sad. Well, what do I mean by sad? Let me look at my Wheel of Feels. I feel vulnerable. Well, what makes me feel vulnerable? Do I feel fragile or do I feel victimized? And so you can kind of, using an app like this, drill down. I think that's more personally useful for you to kind of think through your emotions and sit with your emotions and be more specific. I find that by clarifying my emotions, going from just I'm sad to, well, what is it? Going, okay, well, I'm feeling vulnerable. That's more helpful than sadness. Sadness is too generic. If I say I'm feeling vulnerable, I can go, okay, well, finances are tight. Things around the house are falling apart and I don't have the energy or the effort or the skills to fix them. I'm feeling exposed, right? So that can help me problem solve around these emotions or sit with these emotions in a more secure way. So it's very useful. So I think Brené Brown's book is good. I think her TV special is worth the watch. I don't think the book is worth it. I think the TV special is worth it. And I think it's a good start to listen to some of her TED Talks and the way that she kind of redeems some of these negative emotions like shame. She has a lot to say about shame. That being said, Brené, I thought she stepped on a few landmines with me. And I thought this was an interesting way to have a deeper conversation. I want to talk about the church versus therapy. Church versus therapy. When I was a little boy, I was in love with church. My parents would take me to church. We went to this mega church, and the senior pastor of that church actually specialized in children's ministry. So the church just did a fantastic job of indoctrinating me and getting me on board in all the best ways. And he had his own TV special called The Gospel Bill Show. And I loved my church experience. I wanted to be at church. My pastors were my role models. And I thought that, we're called to be disciples and to make disciples. And so I really thought, man, if you are the best disciple and good at making disciples, then the end result is that you'll become a pastor. And as I grew up playing video games, you might, in a video game, sometimes there's a class tree. So you start as, like, let's say a barbarian with no armor and just a club. And then you level up your skills and you're no longer a barbarian, you're a warrior, and you wear chainmail armor with a rusty sword, and then you become a knight, and then you got heavy plate mail and a claymore and a tower shield, right? And so this idea of going up a skill tree, in my head as a kid, I thought, well, if I'm going to go up the skill tree from just basic congregant to a leader to a small group leader to a volunteer, all the way up and up and up till, well, the end result's a pastor. Like, if you are succeeding at Christianity, you're going to be a pastor. And I thought pastors were just these master Jedi who were just going out and healing people and loving on people and being Jesus. And as I grew up and became a pastor and got behind the scenes and met the elder boards and saw the handbooks and the policies and really saw how the sausage was made, I've learned that churches are not that. Churches are good. Churches have a function. But churches, the organization, are not the church as prescribed by Scripture. So the church, the body of Christ, is all of the believers who are caught up in the following of Jesus Christ. And the way that I clarify that is just the term Christian, which is nowhere in the Bible. Originally, the early church were known as the Way. People made fun of them and called them little Christs, which is Christian. It was a slur, and Christians thought, we love to be little Christs. We will take your slur and create it as a badge of honor, and we took on the name Christian. So my thought is, how do you know if you belong to the body of Christ? I would say, well, are you in all efforts trying to be conformed to the image of Christ? Are you trying to be a little Christ? If you're trying to be a little Christ, then you are by definition Christian. Now, there's different denominations and there's different beliefs, and there's Baptist and Presbyterian and Methodist and Lutheran and Catholic. And I would say that Paul writes and he says, the one who profanes the day or curses the day, curses it unto the Lord. And the one who honors that day, that same day as holy, honors it as holy unto the Lord. Let each be convinced in their own mind. Who are you to judge another man's servant? And this is where I studied in college denominationalism. And what I took away from studying denominations is that denominations exist because we have the freedom for them to exist. But either way, too much of a caveat. When I was getting into the church and just volunteering, and then became an intern and a ministry leader and all of these things. Then I eventually was on staff and paid and collected a salary and reported to the senior pastor, the associate pastor, met with the elders, all of this. I began to realize that churches are nonprofit organizations with a ministry focus. So another non-church, what we would call a para-church organization, which means they're like a ministry, but they're not a church. I would say one great one is Phoenix Rescue Mission here in Arizona. Fantastic people at Phoenix Rescue Mission. I did some work with them. I did tech support for them, and the people I talked to there, a lot of them used to be homeless. They were rehabilitated, and now they are functioning members of society, many of which working for that company, focused on helping homeless people. If you approach Phoenix Rescue Mission as a person struggling with divorce and single parenting and go, hey, I need help, they're not really going to help you. Why? Because you're not homeless. That's not their mission. That's not their goal. And so churches are very much the same. They exist to put on a very good product on Sunday morning. Their hope is that they are usually geared towards evangelism, so that way people who are unchurched or uneducated in Scripture can get a good spiritual education or teaching. Most pastors would say that that's not going to be where they're going to get the most information. They want you to attend regularly for this worship experience. It's kind of this Christian concert where you get a good spiritual TED Talk, and then they want to funnel you into a small group where you get in a smaller group of believers, and that is where you're going to be equipped with discipleship and then be sent out into the world to go do ministry, but they're really not going to help you with the ministry that you go out and do. That's on you. They are, however, going to call you to volunteer for that Sunday morning event. They cannot run it on their own. So they need child teachers and teen teachers and youth teachers and ushers. They can't, sound technicians and light technicians and instrument are musicians and singers. So they need this. Never teachers, though. They don't need you to teach. You're not allowed to do that. So that's the typical church organization that we see as a nonprofit. It really, what I would say is churches, I would almost label them as a parachurch organization based on evangelism is really kind of how they come across. And so every church is running as a nonprofit has a target demographic. Just as Phoenix Rescue Mission's target demographic is going to be homeless people, most churches have a target demographic, which this day and age, it seems like every church, their target demographic is older boomers who are most likely a specific color specific racial ethnicity. It just seems like you have like white churches and black churches and Chinese churches and Hispanic churches. It's just how it plays out. Like sure, they intermix here and there, but largely it's like, oh, this is a white person church. Like, oh, this is a black people church. And it's in the preaching, it's in the music. It's geared towards a specific racial ethnicity, and then within that, a subset of. I know a church that was targeting divorced single moms. I know a big church here in Phoenix, CCV. I believe they target dads of homes. And so they're gonna target that demographic. So when one of their members goes, man, I've been taught and empowered, and I am passionate, and I want to start a prison ministry. Well, you're not really going to be successful in running that prison ministry through that church. They might pat you on the back. They might give you a room that you can either for free or that you can rent for your own events. But most of those churches exist to get you there on Sunday, get you from Sunday into a small group, get you from a small group back into volunteering, to become a member of the church, and that circle goes round and round and round, right? So because you're volunteering, Sunday runs smoother. They attract more people who go to more small groups. Those small groups grow. People from those small groups then serve together, which helps Sunday run smoother. That's how the sausage is made. Welcome to church. And so Christians or people who attend church, who have grown up in church, they're sold this false idea that church is going to be this place where you are going to be seen individually, that you are going to be noticed and loved and nurtured and discipled. And that might happen. But if that happens, it's not because the organization really deemed it so. It's because beautiful, wonderful people are in that church and they're catching you and they're loving you. Most of the love and care and attention that I received from pastors as a young boy to a young teen to a young adult was outside of their job responsibilities. I know this because I've been a pastor for a church and I've had my assigned duties. I have a friend who stepped out of churches. Him and I were getting lunch together one day, and he just said, man, now that I'm not working for churches anymore, I do way more ministry, way more pastoring than I ever did when I collected a paycheck. And so we're having this movement of people who they kind of think that the church is going to be a one-stop shop for love and care and devotion and attention. And it's not. The church is doing its church thing. And if you fit their demographic, you're going to love it and you're going to fit in, and everything's going to be tailor-made for you. If you're on the margins, if you don't fit within your specific church's target audience, you're going to feel marginalized. You're going to feel left out. The sermons aren't going to preach to you. The events aren't going to cater to you. The small groups aren't going to have a spot for you. It's just not going to fit. And so we have this element of church hurt. Well, now people are hurt by this, and they go to therapy. They go to counseling. Now they'll go to therapy and counseling for all sorts of reasons, outside of the church. But because the church is so ingrained in our culture, there's a church on every street corner. In fact, even in an atheist home with a legacy of atheists, they've grown up surrounded by people who are churchgoers, people who, our money says, in God we trust. And so even if you're not spiritual, you're not religious, or you're another religion other than Christianity, you have been influenced by Christianity here in America. And so we have this reaction to religion. And so that's where I've kind of gotten out of that professional church world where I'm collecting a salary from a church. And my whole goal is I just really want to help people. I want to catch those people on the margins, especially when I found myself in those margins. And I'm sad to say that my eyes were not opened before I was in the margins myself, until I was divorced and a single dad and dealing with homelessness. Before I was in those margins, I couldn't hear, I couldn't see, I couldn't touch or taste how much I just didn't fit into that target demographic anymore. And so my thought with counseling and therapy and coaching and mentoring and all this stuff, and really what I do is mentoring and coaching, is I thought, well, I'm gonna help these people. And so I started to go more into that camp. Now, I'm not anti-church. I go to church every Sunday. I think church is fantastic. I think people should go to church. I love the organization of church. I just want to heal people's mindsets and help them understand the limits. Churches even tout themselves as being this holistic approach to health and spirituality, and they're not. It's not a holistic approach. Only Jesus and the Bible will give you that holistic life advice. And even then, you still need a doctor, right? You still need, like, if you can't just have an ulcer and beat it with the Bible, right? You need doctors. And so, anyways, I want people to understand the limits, right? I think the Bible has wisdom for every situation, but I think part of that wisdom is go see a doctor, right? Sometimes it's go see a therapist or a psychologist. But as I've gotten into this psychology world, I see a lot of hurt, burnt out, anti-religious, pseudo-spiritual people who most therapists that you're going to go see, they're just as anxious and depressed and hurt as their patients. And that's okay. That's part of life's experience. That's part of humanity, to say no one gets through life unscathed. So just because your doctor might have an ailment doesn't mean that he's not a good doctor, right? So, my head's thinking of the TV show House. But so when it comes to Brené Brown, when she talks on reverence and when she talks about unchecked authority of the church, Brené definitely got caught up in that culture war, and I think she wound up kind of anti-religious. When she talked about reverence, she doesn't mention it in her book as much, but in her TV special, she kind of talked about how her kids really shouldn't revere anyone or anything, and how she laughs at irreverent comedies. Her book says this: she laughs at irreverent comedies, but then feels bad about it, and she wants to challenge that feeling bad about it. That there should be no reverence to anyone. That we should all just be court jesters in reverent court, making fun of the king and of spirituality, and we're allowed to not be reverent to anything. That's how she comes across, and I think she develops a good ear for listening to those marginalized groups, the ones that I've been talking about, that are outside, on the outskirts. They're not caught by your church, by your typical church target audience. But I think when she says that reverence is unnecessary, I feel like that crosses a line. She needs to kind of understand that it seems like she's not done with her healing process. And I think when you read her book, it's very self-deprecating. It's very self-aware. I think she would easily acknowledge that. But when she sits up as a teacher and kind of challenges reverence, I think reverence needs to be challenged, but she didn't seem to acknowledge that some things we do need to revere. That there are some pillars in life that are unshakable and that are due respect. I would say one is Jesus. I would say Jesus and God demand our reverence, and that if you would revere God, you would revere the Bible, you would revere Jesus, that you will be honored for it, and that in honoring them, you'll get honor back, and that your life is going to be better. So I think people need to deconstruct a lot of that. Like when I talk about people having the wrong idea of what church is for and what it does, I am talking about a little bit of spiritual deconstruction. A lot of these pastors are, I'm going to get in trouble here, but I'm going to use the word privileged, right? They're privileged, and I don't use that word the same way anyone else in the world uses it, but they have certain benefits, and they were born in certain families, or they go through certain, they jump through the right hoops and they fit those circles. And so they're given authority by the church. And I think all of them have seen, when I talk to them, I feel like they've seen church hurt, but their thought is, well, this weapon of the church has been used for evil. I'll start my own church and I'll use it for good. And I'm not so far against that mindset, but I don't think that they've done enough deconstruction of their own. And so then they begin to talk to people who are deconstructing and tell them, no, don't deconstruct, right? And I think that we need to break down some of these cultural ideas that we've been born with. But what's really important is reconstruction, that you don't leave it deconstructed. And so I think you need to take a careful, almost like a machine approach, right? You're dealing with a computer. You're like, let me take this part out and see what happens. Say, okay. It's like when people are doing brain surgery and they'll have someone like play the violin while they're working on their brain. It's like, well, we want to make sure we don't take away your ability to play the violin. Same way, when we're doing spiritual deconstruction, we need to be like that brain surgeon having ourselves play the violin. It's like, let's take something out. Are we still playing? Are we still working? Okay, let's put it back in. Let's take this out. And so I think there's an important work. It's definitely nuanced, not something I can cover in one video. But that being said, to get back to the book, I want to say that this is this is a worthwhile icebreaker. It's a worthwhile icebreaker. And I think Brené has successfully broken that ice. It's something worth talking about, discussing. If you do buy the book, leave it on your coffee table, and maybe thumb through it every so often. Give it one good read through. It won't take you long, and then leave it on your coffee table. And as you're talking with people, maybe pull it out and use it in your discussions. Maybe use it to educate your friends, or just a good icebreaker. Either way, I think Brené, like I said, she's intelligent. She's well trained, and she's very articulate, and she's very well spoken. And her TV special is absolutely worth tracking down. Finding her TED Talk on shame is also worth tracking down. So yeah, Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart. I hope, for me personally, it served as a really good conversational piece for my own conversation, just for me to talk through this weird dynamic where, man, sometimes I really don't fit in well with pastors as we talk about the function of church. Kind of as I point out the limits, as I've kind of come to understand the machine of church, and as I go, okay, this is the machine, this is what it does. Pastors seem to not like that. They're like, that's not true. We're everything. We're holistic. And it's like, but you're not, and you don't seem to enjoy this conversation. On the other side, I don't fit in well with therapists and psychologists who are so anti-religious, I would say so open-minded that maybe they've let too much in and not questioned it, and also very closed-minded in the wrong areas when it comes to religion and church. And so they we had a bad experience here, so we're going to leave it forever. And it's like, well, come on, let's do a little bit more. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think Jesus is right in the center. I think Jesus criticized the Pharisees. I think he criticized the temple. But I also think Jesus, although he threw parties with tax collectors and prostitutes, he himself wasn't a tax collector or a prostitute, right? So I've been trying to find in my own spiritual journey that Jesus-centered middle ground. Okay, where can I love my church and understand its limitations and see the nonprofit organization for what it is, and not be burned by that, and help other people to see it, and help them, by understanding it, not be burned by it. But also, as we enter into these conversations about being self-led, like as we talked about internal family systems, or being irreverent, carte blanche, I still want to be reverent to God. I don't want to be self-led. I want to be Jesus-led. I want to be Jesus-centered. I don't want to be self-centered. I want to be Jesus-centered. And so as we review more and more of these books, that's going to continue to be my takeaway in these situations is I'm trying to find, you're joining me on this journey, but I'm trying to find that beautiful, beautiful middle ground of, man, the church isn't perfect. There are people who are missed by it and hurt by it, and I want to hear them, and I want to find them. The same way that the temple in Jesus's time, they were missed and hurt and marginalized by the temple, and Jesus found them. We have Pharisees today. They're called pastors. Not all pastors, right? But a good pastor will tell you that there are pastors who are Pharisees, and unfortunately, they're more common than you would hope. And then on the flip side, though, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't want to just jump into, okay, I'm going to be, so self-led that there is no truth. Everything's irreverent. I want to have wisdom. And I think wisdom cuts somewhere in that divide. And that's the journey I find myself on. I hope you guys find yourself on a similar journey, and we'll be back to review more books later. But you guys have a good one, and it's close to Thanksgiving, so you have yourself a happy Thanksgiving. Gobble, gobble. Bye.